Hey everybody, welcome to episode 4 of the Rugged Wisdom Podcast. I'm excited about today. We jokingly call this the book club, but this is books every man should read, but maybe hasn't. Today we're going to kick it off with C.S. Lewis's classic, The Screwtape Letters, talk about some of the underlying things of why he wrote the book, especially World War II, and some things that led up to it. But let's go ahead and let's jump into the show.
Welcome to the Rugged Wisdom Podcast, hosted by myself, Scott Johnson, and my buddy, Joe Wedra. Join us each week as we discuss timeless truths, share great stories, and create momentum in our daily lives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share wherever you enjoy this podcast. We greatly appreciate it. And now, let's get on with the show.
Welcome back into Rugged Wisdom Book Club. I guess this is Book Club.
Yeah, well,
Something like that?
I think we titled this Books That Every Man Should Read, but probably hasn't.
Which is fitting.
Yeah, fitting. Now, I mean, obviously, this first one right out the jump, Screwtape Letters, a lot of dudes may have read, but we'll get into some stuff, some books that might be a little bit off the road a little bit.
Yeah, pretty excited about it.
Yeah, definitely.
Good deal. I'm Joe Wedra, Scott Johnson.
What's happening?
And if you haven't, well, you might already know this because you've listened to it, but this is what we're talking about today. C.S. Lewis, Screwtape Letters.
Yeah.
First of all, I guess let's get into why we're doing this.
Yeah, that's a great question. Why? I feel like that as part of wisdom is that we're standing upon the shoulders of a lot of guys that's come, and men and women that come before us. I guess just full disclosure here. My hope is to expose people to some books, some classical literature. Most of the books that we choose are pretty much from classical literature. We've got stuff that we've selected, 12 books to do this year. Most of them are from the 20th century, some 18th, but all the way back to, we'll look at some, I think we might get into some Plato, some Aristotle. We'll get back to some older stuff, and then things, maybe some Kierkegaard in the 19th century, and everything in between. A few actually modern books as well. I think we're going to throw some Cormac McCarthy up there, that kind of stuff. But here's the thing. I think reading and really getting your hand on a book, whether you read it or listen to it, okay? I'm not...
We don't judge.
We don't judge. Either way, I listen to probably as many or more than I actually read. It's more about time. But exposing people to the primary document and being able to... Look, just be interesting.
Yeah. It's there.
Just be read enough to be interesting, and then read enough to know something, right? Too.
Well, it's like I can carry a conversation. This comes up. C.S. Lewis comes up. I'm going to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, so I want to jump into this book, and so how do we choose these books? I think one day I sat down. It was before a workout. It was about 4:45 in the morning. I was sitting in my truck, and
Casually.
and I was I'm going to make a list on my phone of books that I think that I like. And not just books. I went about this from the author standpoint, like exposing people to an author. Not all of them that I agree with. That wasn't the rubric. It was like, hey, I think these are primary texts that a man should read.
This is what's important.
So I just picked out. I think I routed off 20 authors and just said, and then I texted you. I was like, hey, here's a list. And so we went through the list. We redacted it down from about 20 to 12. And then we said, let's prioritize them. And let's start with Screwtape. Well, actually, we said, let's start with C.S. Lewis.
We did.
And I threw 3 books on the table. Obviously, Narnia, which is his most noted fiction work, but that wasn't the one. It was kind of, we debated, was it going to be Screwtape or Mere Christianity? But you had a take. You said, I want to do Screwtape. Why'd you say that?
I just think Screwtape is one of those. Well, one, it's an introductory. It's the C.S. Lewis I want to know. But also, I just think in general, when you look at this book, it is applicable, and it's an easy, here we go, jumping off point. This is what we're trying to do. And I think the nature of this book, because it is satire, it's a very, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but I just think it's the easiest to say, hey, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going. And the way C.S. Lewis writes, it's just different. It's particularly in this book, the satire. It's very, very different than what we're accustomed to reading.
Yeah. So I want to jump in. So let's talk about how we're going to do the book club. All right, how are we going to do the book club? Well, we're basically going to break down the books into 3 segments. We're going to talk about the author, who wrote it. Like, just tell me, like, who is this dude? Who wrote this? Like, tell me what's going on in his life. Why did he write it? Like, what was going on in the background? Kind of like, because every book is a context, right? It's coming out of something. We'll talk about who wrote it. We'll talk about what's in it. Now, we're going to be careful there because we don't want to ruin the book to some degree.
We don't have spoiler alerts here.
So we'll talk about what's in the book, and what would you get from the book?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I read that book, what's in that book?
Yep.
Maybe how should I go about reading the book? Because you read books differently.
Sure.
Because there's actually a really good book that make the list called How to Read. How to Read a Book.
It seems like it should make the list.
It should make, but it's about how to approach genres of literature. Like, for example, you said this is satire, allegory. Like, how do you approach that?
Sure.
So we'll talk about who wrote it. We'll talk about what's in the book. Like, what are you going to experience in the text? And then the third piece would be, why does it matter?
Sure.
Or, all right, tell me why that's applicable to my life. Right.
Yeah.
And
what am I going to do with it? Now that I've read it, what do I do?
Yeah, what I do. So that's how we're going to go about it.
So C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, let's jump right into the man.
I'm really interested because I will tell you not my first exposure to C.S. Lewis, but it's kind of a good story to get us into this. So I was in Chapel Hill at school. It was a Friday night. Everyone else was doing other things. And there was someone who came to our school. It was a play about C.S. Lewis. This guy, he toured the country as C.S. Lewis. And so
Like a monologue?
It was.
Oh, yeah?
It was pretty lengthy. It was like a 3-hour production with intermission and everything. So everyone else was doing their thing on a Friday night, and I had a buddy, and we both like to read. We were like, well, we're not going out tonight doing anything. Like, do you want to go to this?
Dork alert.
Yeah, do you want to go to this C.S.
Hey, buddy,
Lewis play?
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, that's
there.
exactly what it was.
I will admit, I have been to a author's book reading on a Friday night. Yes.
It was a Friday night, and it was like, the semester was coming to an end, and I was like, let's go see C.S. Lewis. So essentially, we went to go see C.S. Lewis, a play about C.S. Lewis. So that was my first introduction, and it was reading a little bit, but a lot of Mere Christianity. But it really introduced me to who this guy was, Clive Staples Lewis, who he was, and jump off a little bit there, but really interesting story, and I think we know him from Narnia. A lot of us, maybe introduction, but so much more to the man.
Yeah. I'll tell you my first foray into Lewis. I'm going to date myself a little bit here, right?
Okay.
Now, obviously, this book, so he lived in the earlier parts. He was writing this book in the 30s to the 40s to the 50s. He died in the 60s, which I'll get to in a minute. It was actually, I realized something while prepping for this. The date of his death happened simultaneously to one of the most famous deaths in America.
Really?
Yeah, I'll get into that.
Okay.
But wait. But wait, there's more. So back in 2001, I took a job as a pastor of 3 local churches down in Georgetown, South Carolina, right out of Andrews. And the pastor that lived there before me, I moved into this house, and he retired. The guy in front of me, I replaced the guy. So this church, the guy retired, and then I came in at 21 years of age.
So you're 21.
I was 21.
Okay.
And he left his library for me. He didn't really know me, but he was like, and not his whole library, but he left a bunch of books, and he left a lot of audio cassettes, books on tape. Yeah. Now, this is back 2001, and CDs were a thing, but for this guy, he had collected a lot of books on tape. He actually had one of the tapes that I used to ride and listen to in my truck was Screwtape Letters, read by John Cleese.
Okay.
Now, that name won't ring a bell until I said Monty Python. And if you know Monty Python and the circus, the flying circus, and the life of Brian, okay, John Cleese was one of the minds behind Monty Python, John Cleese, and he read it. So it was John Cleese reading Screwtape Letters.
Was this your first introduction to Screwtape?
It was. Okay. So I didn't read it. I listened to it on a tape. A cassette tape.
In 2001.
2001 in my
Chevy. What are you driving in?
Chevy Blazer.
Right.
Yeah, red 4-door Chevy Blazer. Yeah, surf racks on top. It was a hot ride, man. But
listening to Screwtape, rolling down. Yeah,
so I listen to a lot of tapes and CDs as well. But tapes, what I would do is I rode an hour to school every day. And so I had to fill that time. Sure. And so this is not, the internet's not thing you can't, there's no Audible, there's no, so you got to put something in the truck, you got to shove it into dash to listen to something. I would dump down the audio from movies. So I had Dumb and Dumber on audio tape. Wow. I had Fight Club on audio tape.
So you're listening to movies.
I listened to movies because I could picture the movie right down the road. So I would listen to Dumb and Dumber, Fight Club, Office Space. I could write on the list of movies. I would just basically take a VCR and run audio out into my tape deck, and I would just dump the audio. And it was great entertainment. This is before Audible. This is before.
How many other people were doing this at the time?
I have no idea.
Were you the only person who was
right? Maybe not. I don't know. But so anyway, I was listening to C.S. Lewis, Screwtape Letters. That was my foray into C.S. Lewis. But after being exposed to that, like I really got turned on to his literature. I read Screwtape Letters, and then Mere Christianity came right after that. I do remember I lived in Atlanta when Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe came out into movie theaters. My wife and I think we were dating at the time. I think we were engaged, but I remember I was living in Atlanta, and I remember going to the movies when Narnia hit, and that was kind of, I would say, that really thrust for this generation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of thrust him, like the Narnia series.
That was my first exposure to Lewis.
Yeah, threw it onto the big screen. Obviously, that 7-book trilogy, not trilogy, that sequence there with the Chronicles of Narnia, really probably put him into the limelight. But I want to talk about who the man was.
Yes.
Because here's the, if you're going to read Screwtape, we're going to get into this. This is, you called it fable, right? Or you call it satire. Excuse me. Satire. It might be more allegory. It's a little bit of satire. It's satire. It's satirical that it pokes fun at evil. That's one thing, that evil is impotent. That's part of the themes. But I want to talk about how to read this book. And let's talk about this as a dude, because he actually had some guys in his life that helped him become the man that he was. And some people know this, but one of his closest friends was Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and that series. So these guys in the 1930s were going to Oxford University in England. And so they were there. Now, what's interesting about C.S. Lewis, that this paints a picture of understanding how to read the Screwtape Letters. He served in the First World War. And he came out of that, and then, he came out of First World War, and then he went into professorship, teaching, and that. So he lived a pretty normal life.
He has a familiarity with, he was in the war. But he's also relevant at the time.
So I would think that if you're going to understand Screwtapes in the background here, is like, okay, this is a dude who served in the First World War. He's from Ireland, born in Ireland. So he's technically Irish, born in Ireland, moved to England, and lived there, so he's there in the pre-World War II. He's a professor. So, but he has a buddy, and they're actually meeting together with a group called the Inklings, was the name of their group. And Tolkien was in that group. So he called him Toller. Tolkien called him Jack. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about Jack Lewis. That was his nickname, Jack. And he called Tolkien Toller. Or Tolly was his, like, I've read it two different ways. But they had a group, and they met at a pub. And it was a pub, and dude, I'm trying to remember if it was the Eagle and the Child. It's something like that. I have to look that up.
First of all, can you imagine just, like, casually sitting at the pub and these two guys are next to you? Like, looking back, the people who got to be around that at the time, holy cow.
Okay, imagine you're sitting in a pub in England in the 1920s to 30s. We'll say 19th. I'm gonna use really round numbers here, right? 1930s. Over there in the corner is a handful of guys. There's a Jack Lewis, C.S. Lewis. There's Tolkien and a couple of guys, and they have a group, and they get together. They're called the Inklings, and that was the name of the group. And they would get together, and they would say, "Does anybody have anything good to read?" And what they would do is they would write stories and read it aloud to each other, and get feedback.
That's unreal.
Now, what's interesting is that Lewis would write these ideas. He wrote over about 40 books, but 40 writings that he published. And Tolkien would write, and they would read their stuff. So the first drafts of Narnia, the first drafts of The Hobbit, were read in some dudes sitting around drinking a couple pints.
It's like, what do you think?
Like,
right?
Hey, how do you like? Yeah. Now, interesting enough that C.S. Lewis thought that Tolkien's stuff was like out there.
Which you could see if you know Tolkien. You could see if you compare the two.
He thought that his stories went on way too long, and they droned on this kind of stuff. Now, fair enough.
Yeah,
Tolkien's a Christian before C.S. Lewis is, for I think about 13 years. It took somewhere by that time, but they're sharing ideas and they're writing. Now think about this: that as these guys are writing, I want to just take a little sidestep in history, because here's 200 years earlier. I want to point this out, that when Tolkien and C.S. Lewis are meeting in a pub at Oxford, England, right? In the 1930s. 200 years prior to that, there was another group of dudes that met at Oxford University. There was a guy named Charles Wesley, and then he got his brother involved, and then a couple of the guys, and another guy named George Whitfield was involved in that. And they had a group that met together, and they started. I don't have my notes in front of me, so I'm just pulling this straight out of my butt here. But 1729, they met, and they had this group called the Holy Club.
It's about 200 years.
200 years. Now, all this is because understanding how some of the greatest movements in history, or even the greatest literature, came from a couple dudes who were in their 20s, who were like post-college graduate level.
Yeah.
Hanging out, going, "Hey, I've read something. I'm reading something here. Can you get some feedback?"
What do you think? Right.
So 200 years later, you have Charles Wesley, John Wesley, and they're meeting in this Holy Club. That Holy Club, they actually were called the Holy Club. They were called the Bible Moths. They were called the super irrigation men, which means super irrigation, that you have to do extra works to earn salvation. It's a theological term.
Right.
But they met because they wanted to take their faith seriously.
Sure.
Now, why does that matter? Well, John Wesley went on to become an Anglican priest that started the Methodist movement. The Methodist Church came out of those guys. They called them Methodists, which actually was like slant. It was actually, they were poking fun at them.
Really?
The word Methodist was not. It was meant to. Actually, someone made that up to make fun of these dudes because they had this method to their spiritual walk. They were called the Bible Moths, the Methodists, the Holy Club. So in Oxford, England, we see dudes gathering around talking about books. Okay, John Wesley, Charles Wesley. Charles Wesley becomes one of the most prolific hymn writers of the 18th century. John Wesley creates the Methodist movement that launches into the colonies. These dudes did mission trips together. And so here's what I see, this parallel. When I think about C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, I think about 200 years later, these great movements that came out of Oxford, England, with a bunch of dudes who sat around like, "Hey man, what do you think about this?"
Yes.
So I think that's a cool little, like, I'm just trying to help paint the picture that there is there's something in the culture around Oxford about dudes getting together and talking about books.
It's this brotherhood.
It is a brotherhood.
It is a brotherhood surrounding things that we don't normally.
Which is why you say, why do we want to start this book?
Why does it matter?
Here's the thing. Here we are, 2023. Couple dudes sitting around talking about books.
Yep.
I think to myself, well, this is what C.S. Lewis did.
This is where it started.
With Tolkien.
Yep.
Literally, they sat down and said, "Hey, man, I got an idea." And that idea was The Hobbit. Okay?
Yeah.
And the whole universe that came out of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
But to your point, it's being willing to just sit and talk and think.
That's it. So being able for dudes to sit down and talk about literature, whether that's scripture, whether it's talking about books or ideas, and to do it in community with the vulnerability to say, like, "Hey, can I put an idea on the table?"
Sure. You read it this way. I maybe read it this way.
Yeah.
Why is that?
So that's some of the context, because I think that's the man behind the man. When you talk about C.S. Lewis, I can't think about C.S. Lewis in a vacuum.
Sure.
I see him in a community of dudes who he's like, well, they're professors together, they're sharing life, and so much that later on that Tolkien, his witness to C.S. Lewis, he becomes a Christian later on. Like, he moved from this place of his kind of anti-God, and very antagonistic, to a place of theism, to a place of accepting Christianity.
Yeah.
And because of that, sitting around talking about books and art and like imagining worlds, one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century is a product of dudes sitting around saying, let's talk about some books.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the background, the war.
Sure.
So if someone were going to read Screwtape Letters, and you actually pick it up in the book that he mentions the war.
Which, by the way, this book was dedicated to Tolkien.
Oh yeah,
that's super interesting.
Yeah,
you'll find it right here. I mean,
it's a cool thing in the preface.
It's just neat talking about that.
J.R. Tolkien is right there.
Full circle.
So it put it all in perspective. So here's what I would say. Okay, you got C.S. Lewis. He's a prodigious guy. I meant to mention that. Like, he actually finished a 3-year postgraduate degree in 1 year. He was actually could read at 3 years old. Like C.S. Lewis was a prodigy.
He was that dude.
He was that dude. He was a stud when it come to writing and thinking. He mastered foreign languages, Latin, Greek. He was a linguist. All right, so he actually has a good handle on this. So that's who he was as the dude. Now, what's going on in Europe in 1939? Right, we see World War II it's impending,
emerging. Right.
It's emerging. In 39, so we see Germany invading Poland. We see things happening. We see stuff happening in the theater of the Pacific in Japan. So what's interesting, imagine being a professor who's trying to teach young men who are looking out the window thinking, are we going to war today?
Yeah. And that context is important here.
That's why I don't want to skimp on this.
Yeah.
Because that is the context by which he writes this book.
Yep.
Is a nation, not even a nation, an allied force fighting an axis of evil. And he's trying to help young people at a collegiate level, and not only there, but that's where it works. What do we do in culture when our culture is literally going to war?
Yeah.
And now we know one of the most costliest battles of history that we know. And he publishes this book in 1941. So we're talking about Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. We're right there.
We're there.
Yeah.
Now, that's important if you read Screwtape Letters, because here's what I said. Most people come at Screwtape Letters with, well, it's about spiritual warfare.
Which is true.
It is. That's certainly, that is what it's about. But without understanding C.S. Lewis, understanding like, oh, so this is written in World War, like as we're ramping to World War II, because he's actually helping a nation deal with their existential angst and questions about war. Yes. And he actually addresses war in the book about
not only is the spiritual world crumbling, but the world itself.
That's right.
Everything, nothing is on a level. We're not level here. We're not just cruising along, rolling along. There's a lot happening.
I think that's the genius of Screwtape Letters. At a deeper level, is it about the spiritual warfare of the Christian or the patient, right?
Sure.
Well, okay, the patient, right?
Right.
Yes. But that's not... Okay, so when Tolkien's writing The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, he's creating this universe, right? At the fiction level, the fantasy level, right? But you see all these Christology in it. You see all these levels of thinking. So Screwtape Letters is his way of like, okay, how do we handle the anxiety of war? And are we at war? Okay, yeah, we're at a political war, but there's a spiritual war. So he sees the interdimensional, way bigger picture. So when you say when it's satire, it's allegory, it's all these things because it needs to be read in the context. Yes. Right? And so that's the man himself. That's what I'd say about C.S. Lewis to get us to a place of how this book.
And we could talk a lot about, he's kind of, I always think of him, he's like the great unifier, right? Across Christianity, C.S. Lewis. The name C.S. Lewis carries weight no matter where in Christianity you are. C.S. Lewis, in my mind, and that's why is the great unifier. He unifies us. There's a lot of people, a lot of figures, you might say, well, there's a lot of division. How do you view this author versus that author? But when you think about C.S. Lewis, in my perspective, the great unifier is what comes to mind. And we could get into that a lot more.
I want to give one just random fact.
We like random facts here.
So he was 64 years old when he died. He died on November the 22nd, 1963, a week before his 65th birthday. So I saw that date, and I was like, man, that date sounds familiar. You know what happened November 22nd, 1963?
I would like to hear it.
JFK was shot.
Huh. Talk about notable.
Yeah. So, okay, interesting facts.
Yes.
The day that C.S. Lewis dies, the reason it was downplayed was because a sitting American president, right, was assassinated.
Right.
Okay. So, interestingly enough, he dies at 64, a week before 65. I've read that Tolkien didn't go to his funeral.
Interesting.
And that his funeral was like no fanfare, small.
Surely by request, I would imagine.
I would go read on that. Go read on. It's all over the internet. You can read it. Yeah. But okay, so I would say that we're reading one of the most influential writers and theologians. One of. I'm not saying the one of. But he died on the same day that JFK was assassinated, and it's kind of like this big stalwart, like his death and everything just lives in the shadow of the tragedy of what happened with JFK.
Yeah, you wonder what it would have been greeted with.
Yeah, I wonder. I don't know. I saw that. That's interesting. That's just.
We're all about fun facts.
Yeah, I am full of like. Just stupid facts. That's about it.
They're all good. Screwtape Letters.
Let's get it.
Diving into it, and not so we'll get to why it matters in a minute and how it applies, and we talked a little bit about that. But the basis of the book, we're talking about that. Set it up a little bit in terms of what we're looking at, because we have these main characters, right? We have Screwtape, Wormwood, the patient.
Right.
There's a lot going on here. Set up what we're diving into. First couple chapters in terms of, okay, I'm opening this book. What do I expect to see, and where am I going? What's the narrative the journey that I'm about to be?
To put it as the clearest way I can do it, it's 31 chapters, aka 31 letters, written unidirectional, one way. There's one voice. There's only one voice really in the book, and the voice is of Screwtape, hence the name Screwtape Letters. He is in the lower hierarchy and of the framework, he is a demon that is instructing Wormwood how to tempt the patient.
Yes.
Who early on in the book becomes a Christian, and
much to their
chagrin. I would say that you need to understand it's 31 letters written from a superior demon to a lower demon, and interestingly enough, you have to do a mental gymnastics here that actually caused C.S. Lewis a real problem.
Interesting. Explain that a little bit.
When you read the word enemy, you have to know that that's God.
Yes.
It's written from the converse. It's written from the other side. It is written from hell out.
Which will trip you up at first if you start to. That's why I wanted to throw this context in, because you start to read it and you're like, okay, where am I?
Yeah.
You gather it, but it's helpful to know when you're going.
So you have to unthink or think the reverse of everything. So, okay, the enemy is God. Grace is that deplorable notion.
Yeah.
Grace and love is like...
hated in this book.
Hated. Love is hated. Grace is hated. These are notions...
unimaginable.
And so you got to read... Now, interestingly enough, that this getting in this frame of mind caused C.S. Lewis a lot of angst later. I read a
That's interesting.
something later. Some of the books have it. There's actually a postscript at the back where Screwtape gives a toast at a dinner party.
Yes. I don't know if it's in this, but I've read that.
So there's some other writings, and I've read that C.S. Lewis, because he had to get into the mind of a demon,
right,
to write this. Now, what I mean by that, he had to write like a demon, think like a demon. When you speak of God, you have to speak in the negative. Now, that's what I've read about C.S. Lewis is it weighed on him in a way he never dreamt it would.
Imagine that place of every time you're sitting down to write, I am no longer thinking the way that I know to think. I'm having to. It's the exact opposite, but it's heavy.
Which is why I would say when you read the first chapter or the preface, he says, is this believable? Well, you can't believe everything that comes out of hell. So it might be a lie. And I'm not even sure if this is the right order. And when you read it, it is a bit disjointed. 31 chapters is a bit disjointed. And what I'm seeing in that is I see the disjointedness of C.S. Lewis. He didn't sit down and write this at once. It's like, I'm going to write a chapter, have a conversation, I'm going to step out of it.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to step back into it and I write it. So,
but you wonder, it's like, how long can you sit with that? How long can I sit with this perspective of, because he was writing from that standpoint.
So that's what you're going to get. You're going to get 31 letters from Screwtape to my dear Wormwood, which is his, he's teaching him how to. Now let's talk about this, that reading it at a just face level. This is about spiritual warfare.
Yes. Which
is an interesting, wow, what a week to talk about this. We're fresh off of a couple weeks ago, the Grammys, and there's a conversation right now. I know social media right now is like flooded.
That's the thing.
Because here's the thing. Right now we have, when we record this podcast, We're sitting in a place and time where we are coming off the Grammys. I didn't watch it. I saw the recap where you had Sam Smith literally really performing a satanic ritual.
It was a depiction of hell.
On national television, while a revival breaks out at Asbury and across the world. So, what an interesting week to be talking about Screwtape Letters. When as a society, as a culture, here we are, where my social feed this morning was like, well, look at what's going on. This is look the mainstream networks are carrying a satanic ritual, and anyone that's over here having a revival, I understand the upside down nature of, are we having a spiritual warfare? 100%.
Yeah, but the brilliance of, right? I mean, the brilliance of something that we can read like this, and it's just unique, the relevance to your point. Pretty amazing.
It is. I know my takeaways when I read it, the first time I read it, I read it just at face value. I realized, like, so that's how Satan likes to trip me up. Right. Oh, that's how Satan likes to try to unnerve me or to get me off track.
It gives a very unique perspective that I think a lot of us, and I'll say us, haven't ever thought about before, because I think we analyze and we know the tactics, and I think that that's what C.S. Lewis is trying to do here. It's to unearth the tactics that we're also familiar with, yet we're not at all. What's interesting is that C.S. Lewis is ultimately, he's unearthing the tactics that the enemy uses that we're familiar with, but we're not familiar with. We understand the temptations, because I think a lot of times it's, well, these are the temptations. These are the way we talk about those ways. This is the way that the enemy. But this really does a deep dive into exactly the thought process and at least what we believe of what's going on.
I think that if you read this book and you say, what can I get out of it? Well, I think it will expose some ways that we get sidetracked in our faith life. Whereas it's not the big things. Here's what's interesting. So Screwtape, he's this affectionate uncle, right? That's how it's interesting how he calls himself that. Because they hate love, but he signs off as if. So that's what Lewis is doing here, the duplicity of lies. Sure. Like, what do I believe? Which is
brilliant, really.
But the little ways that because he wants a society to get not sidetracked by like war, like the grand thing, like, no, it's just like, well, if you could just get them thinking about philosophies or culture or like things that really doesn't matter, or if you could just get him busy, like just keep him busy. And so I'm not going to give it all away. Right. Obviously, we want people to read the book.
Sure.
But I think what stood out to me was we talk about how like Satan wants to sidetrack us, or that there's this struggle for our soul. But it's I would say, what we would call just the inane or the innocuous ways that, well, that's where most of our attention goes to, is to the media scroll.
Absolutely.
The whiling away of our time, the just trifling our time, or getting irritable.
It's little things.
It's the little things.
I agree. We're going to stay away from spoilers, but I'm going to give two things that I think set this up really well. One's a quote, and one's just kind of setting the scene. The quote, and this is, we could have a whole separate discussion on this, but one of the biggest quotes, and it's midway through the book, and Screwtape's talking to Wormwood, and he's describing, in essence, how do we tempt? This is our goal. This is how we're doing it. And the quote is, "The safest road to hell is the gradual one." And it's a quote that everyone's familiar with, but that really sets up what Screwtape is trying to instruct Wormwood to do, is to say, hey, it's, to your point, it's not the big things, it's the little things. And a great example of that, early in the book, the patient, and this isn't giving away anything, but he becomes a Christian. That's the point. And so they're trying to, so he becomes a Christian, and Screwtape is ultimately saying to Wormwood, listen, it's not the big things. Just get him thinking about how the guy sitting next to him in church is wearing this shirt, or like get him distracted about, and it wasn't this necessarily, but like, she's singing out of tune, right? The little things like that. And I just thought that was, it's so brilliant, and it's a brilliant way to start this narrative off, because it's saying, it is a gradual road. It's not, this is going to happen and all of a sudden our patient is going to come back to our side. Yeah. It's, hey, get him thinking about how ugly the shirt is, or how the sermon, and nowadays, the sermon doesn't, I'm not feeling it today.
Yeah,
right?
I wasn't feeling it today, so therefore it must be bad. Like,
it's brilliant.
Yeah. I think, and obviously we're not going to give away all this in the book because it's a short read comparative to a lot of like his other works that are quite voluminous. This one is an easy read
and a smooth read too.
It's a smooth read, and what I like about it, you could knock out like a chapter in a couple minutes, put it down, pick it up, set it down, that kind of thing. But I would say that one thing that really sticks out to me is that it helps see how evil looks at a eternal timeline and is a patient and persistent evil, whereas humans are temperamental and short-sighted.
Yes.
I think that's a major thing. I will say that this is a book of hope because some people would say, oh, Screwtape Letters, that's a book about spiritual warfare. It is, but here's the thing about it. It's a book of hope because, this isn't a spoiler alert. Evil doesn't win.
Right.
Okay, I don't know how to give away the Bible, but
if you're disappointed, apologies.
Apologies, because like if you've read through Scripture, evil doesn't win.
Never has, never will.
Never has, never will. There may be setbacks along the way, but here's why we call this satire. C.S. Lewis shows how impotent evil is in the presence of a holy God. And evil doesn't win.
Correct.
So you could read this book from two ways. From like, oh, what are the tactics of Satan? And oh, by the way, I need a good reminder that evil doesn't win. Now, I will say this, that I have said this is evil versus God, not evil versus good. Because that is a distinction that you need to get square in your mind.
Please, because I'm curious when you say that.
For C.S. Lewis would never position this as evil versus good, but evil versus God. Because good isn't God. God is God. God is holy and separate. And it's not just this perennial outside of the Christian. When I say evil versus God, that is a Judeo-Christian conversation. That is a perspective from the Judeo-Christian tradition that C.S. Lewis is writing from, not just from the Taoist evil versus good. Whereas it's this, you look at the yin and yang symbol from the Taoist, that you have this eternal struggle. You could go back to the ancient texts of the Middle East. You can go back to the Sumerian text of.
We can get the evil versus good in a lot of things.
But evil versus God, unique, and God wins. The other question, when you get outside of this text, is evil versus good. Good doesn't always win, but God does. Now that's okay. Is that semantics? Maybe,
but it's relevant.
But it's relevant to understand C.S. Lewis's perspective, his worldview, his biblical worldview is evil versus God, not just evil versus good.
Sure, which is important because again, I go back to. We can hear the evil versus good argument outside of Christianity.
100%.
Because it does. To your point, that's what makes the evil versus God distinct, is because you can even, let's go back to the Grammys, right? The evil versus good. You could still look at that perspective and say, oh, that was bad. But why was it bad?
Yeah, because people will say, well, they're just doing art.
Right.
It's just art. It's just art.
Right.
Well, okay, that's an acceptable position when your worldview is evil versus good.
Correct.
And you get to define good.
Correct.
Well, for the cultural or the social or the just a relativist, well then yes. But in a perspective of evil versus God, it's a different question.
It's because why is it evil?
Why is it evil?
It makes it, I can look at that performance and even if I wasn't a Christian, I could still hold the opinion that it was not good.
Good is relative. God is absolute.
Sure.
And therefore that's okay. So that is a good conversation to be having about when we say, hey, it's not just art. This is like detrimental.
Serious
stuff, not to be toyed with. Well, it's because it's not an evil versus good. That's an evil versus God discussion. And that's a worldview. That's a biblical worldview. So, and that is, I would say that is something to keep in mind when you read Screwtape Letters.
Sure, absolutely. Anything else before we start a break real quick?
I really don't give much more away about it. Read it. I think this is a great primer book. Like, this is an accessible book for a dude to pick up or to get on Audible and listen. Sure.
Screwtape Letters, talking about it. When we come back, we'll talk about application. When you read it, what do we do? Come back next.
Hey everybody, Scott here. Want to thank you so much. If you're watching this podcast on YouTube or maybe you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music, thank you for doing that. For everyone who clicks the like and subscribe and they share it on their profile, thank you, because I believe that's the highest compliment
that someone can do with anything that you make is share it with your friends. So we appreciate you doing that, and helps it make it more discoverable. So thank you for helping people find the rugged wisdom. From time to time, you're going to hear us talk about the Corbin Collective, and I wanted to fill you in on about what is the Corbin Collective. The Corbin Collective is the parent organization that's really it's a platform of influence. We help men find some purpose, momentum, and clarity for their lives. We do that not only through the Rugged Wisdom podcast, but through a lot of events that happen throughout the year. Whether it's our Preserve event, which is a hunting event, Expedition, where we take guys backpacking on the Appalachian Trail. This year, we're going to the Grand Tetons in Yellowstone. I take every other year, we take a trip to the Holy Land. We tour Israel for 10 days. Also, our flagship program is called True North. And True North is an opportunity to take guys. We take somewhere 100 guys to the mountains each fall, and we do backpacking. We teach orienteering. You spend the day out hiking. It's a retreat in the mountains for men to find some clarity for their lives. So go to CorbinCollective.com, learn all about what we do, and I look forward to sharing more events with you in the future. So thanks for watching the podcast. Let's get back to the show.
Welcome back in. Screwtape Letters. The conversation continues. Talking a little bit about application. We've discussed C.S. Lewis. We've discussed what the book's about without trying to give too much away.
Right.
I want to talk a little bit about application. And there are a couple of things that we talked a little bit about why this matters, but also the perspective of thinking about things that we maybe are familiar with but don't truly understand what's actually going on. Mm-hmm. My takeaway from this book is it really helped me slow down and consider the little things in life that I think are just normal, mundane, maybe have no purpose behind them. But wow, they actually matter.
Like small things.
Small things matter.
Can become big things.
We talked about like the scene in the church where you're distracted by something.
Right.
Just the idea that I think C.S. Lewis is getting at, to say, hey, these things matter. These things are not happening to you. They're happening, and there's for one way or another, they're going to matter.
Right.
That's what I took away. I guess would be my first kind of jumping off in terms of perspective and application is thinking about little things in the fact that they matter, if that makes sense.
I think that's, wholeheartedly true. That's obvious. That's a grand theme, right? That's almost a major recurring thing. But how C.S. Lewis gets us to do that is important. Mm-hmm. So the journey in how he uses imagination. Now, I said a lot about him and Tolkien, mm-hmm. because I can't quite but wonder who influenced who more. Is The Hobbit and was that like created a sparked something in for
great point.
For him to come up with the Narnia, or there was Narnia as something that inspired Tolkien? Not that, but they play off, right? They play off.
Where's the influence?
But here's what I know: the imagination of these two guys were incredible. Because to be fair, C.S. Lewis wrote somewhere up to 40 writings. Some of them it's hard because there was actually, we would call it a podcast. Mm-hmm. The podcast became Mere Christianity.
That's right. It was audio recordings.
It was audio mm-hmm. recordings that became what we now know as the book Mere Christianity.
It was a lecture series.
Yeah,
right?
And so, but he recorded it,
mm-hmm.
and so it's interesting that what we would call today a podcast became that book.
Mm-hmm.
So a podcast became one of the most influential books.
Yeah.
So now that's in the realm of nonfiction. This is what's up. But in this, the use of imagination and the role of imagination to illuminate truth seems to be instructive in a way, which is because of this. Because now put this against the backdrop of what you would think about Oxford, England, professor, upper class,
You're visualizing it right
okay,
now.
like all
right.
All the uppityness.
Right.
Who dares to dream? Who dares to imagine?
To be outside the box.
Who dares to think about, hey, let's take very serious eternal matters and create some allegory that has instructive truth. Now, why is that important? Because, I think how we get there is important, because this is exactly what Jesus did with a parable.
Yep.
That Jesus says, okay, how can I convey some eternal truths to you? okay, let me tell you a story about some dirt. Let me tell you a
Right.
story about some fish.
Yeah.
Let me tell you some agrarian story.
Yes.
So what I love about this is you kind of got to give yourself permission to get in the mindset and to be playful with imagination, because I think at that point, that's only when we could take ourselves serious.
Sure.
So I think that how he gets about how to now here's the irony of that. You have to be willing to sit with a book that's an imaginative book and quote unquote give it time in order to really get serious.
Sure. Sink in.
Let it sink in.
Right.
And so I like what he's doing there. I think that it's I don't read a lot of fiction personally. I don't read a lot of fiction.
Yeah.
So these are the books that make me slow down and go, like, you know what? I can learn as much from fiction
Sure.
as I can from nonfiction,
100%.
which is what Jesus did.
It's interesting because hearing you say that, because as more of a fiction reader, I viewed it from the opposite perspective, and of like, oh, like I almost felt the perspective of, oh, I want to give this to somebody who doesn't read a lot of fiction, because it's like, man, look at the truth that can be unearthed through.
Yeah.
Just interesting that perspective, because I read a lot of fiction, and I'm like, oh, like I thought of 3 people. I'm like, man, if they could just see this, right? If they could see the storytelling here, so that fascinates me.
Yeah. So not only does he help us to take inventory of the small things in life, but to sit down and to slow down enough to sit and read.
Sure.
Yeah.
Something I want to bring up, because I had it written down, and I think a theme of this book is that when you look at Screwtape, when you look at Wormwood, one of the biggest things that gets emphasized from Screwtape to Wormwood is that we don't want the patient thinking. We don't want the patient present. We don't want them focused on what is currently going on. Let's get them to think about the future. Let's get them to think about distractions. Let's get them to think about things that are not happening. And one of the most disappointing to Screwtape and to Wormwood, one of the most disappointing moments is when they start to realize that the patient is sitting, is thinking, is really focused on what is happening in the present. Then there's one other thing. It talks about when someone, and this is earlier in the book, but it's talking about when an individual gets deeper into their faith, they become less dependent on their emotions, and their faith just becomes habitual.
Sure.
And they think that's the worst thing in the world, right? They're like, hey, they're starting to become less dependent on their emotions, and they're just like a machine. It's like this faith that they have is so ingrained into them, which I found interesting. Those two things, the idea of they don't really, they want to avoid the emotions, but it's also like, man, does that make sense?
It does. 2 things. Let me speak to the latter and then jump to the former. Let me speak to the latter thing you said about the non-emotional side.
Yes.
So that's where, if you are a fan of Stoicism, you'll get that.
Yes.
If you're a fan of Stoicism, you're going to pick up on that. Like, oh, well, it was C.S. Lewis taking a page from Stoicism here, or just the truths that we learn about ourselves. Because he says the greatest injury to man. This is I'm paraphrasing something I read. The greatest injury is that the more he can feel like he's been injured, and he'll take offense to that, especially if you can take his time from him. If you feel like you wasted his time, that's the greatest insult to a person, because you can make more money, you can't make more time.
Yes.
So you'll see some flavors of Stoicism in that. That's the latter thing you said. The first thing you said was about getting people enamored with the past and the future.
Yes.
Worried about what I did wrong, and worried about where I'm going. Whereas the past and the future to God is inconsequential, because God doesn't exist on our timeline. That God is a continual unfolding of God's self in the present.
Interesting.
And humans are missing out on the fullness of God, who is a continual unfolding of God's self in the present, because we're worried about the past, worried about the future, and therefore we don't know how to sit in the holiness of God, in the present, in the moment, which is what Wormwood, is like, hey, Wormwood, go do this. Get him to get worried about what he did yesterday,
right,
and worry about what he's going to. Don't let him sit in the presence of God and be present with God. Okay, because here's the thing. Think about this. Roll that out for eternity in heaven. Is heaven to be thought of as linear? No. It's a presence with God.
Ongoing.
Continual unfolding of God in the present. that we're to be present with God. Right. And so it's but humans, we work on this linear thing. And it seems like we're more worried about yesterday and tomorrow than I am today. And I missed my daughter's question this morning.
Right.
Because I was trying to figure out what I had to do next. Right.
Sure.
Well, okay. Well, Satan wins. Because
it's that perspective.
Yeah,
though,
that's why you read the book.
Yes.
You're like, oh, I see. Okay.
It shows you the power of distraction in a way that I think a lot of other things don't, particularly, and that's why the relevance of this book, which was written when, I mean, I could pull up.
I think published in 41.
Okay. Around there.
Yeah.
In 2023, how relevant it is, because when I say the word distraction, what's around us constantly? I speak from a younger generation, right? I'm 24. I am distracted constantly. As someone who considers myself to be someone who tries to not be distracted, I still am very distracted. And that's what I think for me was relatable. Talk a little bit about, I'm curious, kind of the bigger takeaways that you saw in this book. I mean, obviously we hit on the themes. Anything else that stood out in terms of, man, this was unique to Lewis, unique to Screwtape, a reason you need to read?
Every time I read Screwtape, and I'll be honest with you, this might be my third or fourth reading of it over the last 20 years.
Which, reminder, started in 2001.
It did, yeah. So
audiobook,
tape,
audio tape,
cassette tape. This time it hit me different, and this time it hit me about the glorification of the war complex.
Yeah, dive into that,
because that is a theme that's in this book. Because Wormwood gets excited because the Europeans are going to war. And he's like, yes, there'll be bloodshed, there'll be killing, this is great. And Screwtape says, okay, slow your roll. That might not be a good thing. Because there's two ways that humans can respond to war. Well, we can glorify it, or it could horrify us. And if it horrifies them, it would draw them closer to their creator.
Which is the last thing that Screwtape
It's the last thing that they want. So he says, hey, before you go praising war, it could backfire against us. So there's some conversation about, so what should the Christian's response be to political realm?
Sure.
So for me, this time around, the first two times I read it, it hit me at the spiritual level. This time I read it, it hit me at a political level.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think? What's the stage? Is it stage of life? I mean,
stage of life. We're never the person we were yesterday, and not the person I'll be tomorrow. A man is a river, right?
Sure.
So just like when I read Scripture, it's the living Word of God, and so it hits me different because it's instructing me. But every time I watch a movie, read a book, anything, you're like, oh, I never saw that before. Or my frame of reference was different.
Sure.
I know. That's just where I was when I read it this time. But it caused me to start thinking more about, let me think through this as a grand narrative about what is my Christian response in the political realm. And when I mean political, I mean the world. I don't mean like politics.
Right.
Yes, that's included. But my interaction with the world and culture.
Sure.
I read it at a private level. And when I say I'm reading it at a political level, I'm reading it more at a social level.
Interesting.
A social level. Probably because of my job. The first time I read this, I was a young pastor in my first job. First time, no staff.
Yeah.
Now, we have a staff of 30 people.
Sure. And
multiple locations. And, and the Corbin Collective has a lot of moving parts. So I'm a different person.
Sure.
And I see, okay, how are we affecting the larger?
Yeah.
And how are we being responsible with our Christian witness in the larger level?
It's interesting that this book can be viewed from that perspective, though, of it's not, because it's interesting you say that, because then I read it in my stage of life, and I'm thinking, man, this hits home on this, and this, that just doesn't make sense to me. Wow, the spiritual warfare thought process for me. So it's interesting that you can read this book, and that's why I hope that listeners will respond and say, hey, this is what I gathered from it, because I think that particularly for this book, that will be interesting to see someone who maybe is not familiar with Lewis or certainly not familiar with Screwtape Letters. How did it speak to you?
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the book's going to hit you at different levels. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, take any book. Take Narnia. Let's take, I don't know, one of the seven. Let's say the Dawn Treader or the Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe.
Yep.
All right, when I read that as a kid, all right, it's just fantasy. It's like that. I read that as a the first time I sat down and read like through it again
Right.
was as a young married guy. Now when I read it as a father, I read it differently.
Sure.
So I would just say that where you are, it will hit you right where it needs to, I guess, or where you're in your scope of life.
Sure. A few minutes left. The one other note that I wanted to, and we talked about this a little bit, but I just, being aware of the battle that's around us, being aware of the things that are around us, I think is a huge theme in this book. And I would almost venture to say that the reason, I guess I won't say that, but one of the reasons that he could have written this book is he wanted Christians to be aware of the battle.
Yes.
Because the battle is there. The battle is not going anywhere on this earth. And it really does bring an awareness of when I walk through my day-to-day, and we talk about application, and this is where I really think it drives home. My day-to-day, this book might give you some perspective. It might make you more aware of the battle that's going on, which I think is precisely, I would imagine, what Lewis was trying to do.
I think so, because we notice something he does. Lewis actually, in order to get people to take the demons seriously, he has to dress the devil up in a red jumpsuit.
Right.
Now, that's not in this book.
Right.
I'm using it as a
sure.
And what I mean by that, because so at one point, Screwtape, he turns into a centipede. Like, spoiler alert, it's because he has a temper tantrum.
Right.
Well,
it was a bad day.
He had a bad day. Bad day at the office. Which, by the way, that's a level you can read this book, because C.S. Lewis, Wormwood works at a corporate office. And so it's interesting because hell is the corporate world. That's a level of the post-industrial revolution in Europe of hell is actually this bureaucratic office world who's someone who wants to write fantasy and teach intellectuals.
Right.
He doesn't want no part of that world. So that's an interesting level. You can read that. But what he's doing there is sometimes if we can get people to laugh at a situation, well, we'll get closer to it. What C.S. Lewis does here, he kind of wants to make Screwtape and Wormwood like, well, you almost kind of feel sorry for Wormwood because he's losing.
That's right.
And you want to root for him a little bit of way. And you're like, wait, why am I rooting for Wormwood here?
You get drawn into that.
Yeah,
though,
or am I rooting
book.
for the patient? What am I doing here? Well, okay. So it should awaken me to go like, wait a minute, what am I doing with my life?
Right.
Am I rooting for good? Am I rooting for evil? Am I rooting for okay, you know what? This has gotten me close enough to the idea, spiritual, what if it is real? Yeah. Okay, so he's introducing you to this talk about spiritual warfare. It is real. It is, I could give you story after story. I had a situation, and I'm not going to go into this, but just to say this, I had a funeral a few weeks ago. In the spiritual warfare, while I was presenting the gospel at a funeral, I had two Wiccans and one Norse, a guy who's a practicing Norse and some pagan religions. While I was preaching and presenting the gospel at a funeral and was confronting death itself with resurrection theology, that the warfare was going on so much so that the two musicians who were behind me on stage afterwards said, "What was that?"
Wow.
And they said, "What just happened in that room?" And I said, "You saw what was going on while I was communicating the gospel." And
this is real.
This is real. Now, ask me. Ask me personally. I would tell you about spiritual warfare. I would tell you that it's real. C.S. Lewis just puts it on the table.
Sure. Introduces it
through satire.
Sure.
Right? But to get the conversation going.
Right.
And that's the point. Why we want you to read the book is because should we turn a blind eye to Sam Smith and the Grammys? Should we turn a blind eye to the Super Bowl halftime show and the religious symbolatry that was there? And okay, so yeah, like call me a conspiracist. I've been called worse.
No, I understand though.
Or call me a realist.
Right. And it opens your eyes to the things around us. And I guess the final takeaway and the final thought question that I would have, if you listen to this, maybe you haven't read the book, so maybe it's hard to answer this. But as someone who has read the book, where do we go? What road is this book going to lead you on? If let's just say I'm the perspective, I haven't read the book. I want to know, after I read this book, what road is it going to take me on? Where am I heading? Because as someone who just recently read the book for the second time around, I feel there's a specific road, and I guess it's come across, but just general awareness, general understanding of what might be going on. if you were talking to somebody to say, hey, after I read this book, not usually we'll talk about what to expect, but what to expect after you read this book, the perspective that you're going to take away. I'll let you go with that one, and just kind of thinking about what can they expect after they read this book. What's the journey?
Well, I would think at the literary level, I think it's a great introduction to C.S. Lewis. It's a great way to get you introduced to some of his writings because it's a very accessible book. So at the literary level, I go like, great, okay, cool. So now you have access to an author, great. And even maybe from this podcast, you're like, oh, okay, I feel like I know where C.S. Lewis fits into the world history. Okay, that's great. Oh, okay. Well, maybe this is I need to read this historically. So you read it from the literary way, historically. Okay, this is commentary about a society in World War II. Yeah. Like, okay, that's good. Let's read it from that lens. Okay, now let's historical perspective. Okay, let's read it at the theological perspective. Okay, what do I do with this? That's a question. And I think that where you are in your life and your spiritual walk of maturity will determine that. For some people, they go like, I don't know, maybe this spiritual warfare is actually like legit. Maybe this is a thing. Okay, go chase that down and figure it out.
Yeah,
right?
dive in.
To start asking more questions. I think why he wrote this book, he wanted people to go like, hey, I don't know, maybe this is something I should not turn a blind eye to. Maybe this is real. And oh, by the way, I see myself in the book. And because, okay, well, let's think about that. If you see yourself in this book after reading it and going like, yeah, I'm easily annoyed, or I'm easily like put off because church service, I didn't sing my songs today, or like, I didn't like that, or it was uncomfortable, or maybe I don't have the patience to sit down with a good book, and maybe I just get distracted, and like God's like, I was revealing something, and then like squirrel, or a Facebook notification.
Right.
Even if it causes you to be aware of the notifications on your phone, this book can do even that.
Yeah.
I mean, at just that micro level.
Yeah.
Just at that. So I think it will expose something in us, in you, that will create a dialogue and maybe just get a conversation started.
Particularly for a culture that I would say struggles with distraction.
Yeah, a culture that's increasingly afraid to talk about spiritual things.
Which is a whole separate.
But that's the whole point of the book.
It is.
That's the whole point of the book.
The brilliance of C.S. Lewis lives on.
Yes, it does.
First edition of, I keep saying book club. I mean, first edition, but it is. I enjoyed this. I think it's a great way to break down.
Oh, we got some great books coming in the future too, man. We're gonna get not only just in C.S. Lewis, we're gonna get like historical stuff. Yeah. Man, we might even get into some Kierkegaard, some Dostoevsky. Who knows? Like we got some cool stuff lined up.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, I just want guys to go like, oh, okay, I'll give that book a shot. That's it.
Absolutely. And the perspective we're going to hope to bring is that, you don't, even if you're not this, don't identify as a reader, right? Because it's still going to be applicable. It's still going to be enjoyable. I think that's the goal.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
I want to close with this. I have a challenge. I got a challenge.
Let's throw it out there.
I love to challenge men because I love to challenge men. So I got to tell you something about myself. I got through high school because I could take a test. Like, I didn't have to study, right? I just knew I'd take a test. Like, just like, street smarts my way out of it.
Formula.
I got it, right? Got to college, undergrad. Yeah, I got through undergrad, right? And because it was when I got to seminary, it kicked me in the teeth. I sat down the first semester, and I pulled out all my syllabi, right? And I was like, how much time will if I get to do all the reading? How much? I calculated. I gave myself, okay, I can read X amount of pages per day. Yeah. I mean, per hour, that kind of thing, per minute. I did a little bit of math. I realized in order to keep up with the recommended reading, it was 8 hours a day at my pace. And I remember going, oh my goodness, I am screwed.
What did I get into?
Yeah, what did I get into? And so I prayed a prayer. And I said, Lord, if this is where you have me and this is where you want me and this is this next step in my life, you're going to have to help me to learn to love to read. And I prayed that prayer. Now, you can tune me off right now. You can turn this podcast off right now, right? But here's the challenge. I dare you to pray, Lord, help me to learn to read. Like as a skill.
Yes.
Like as a life skill. Like, I want to get better at reading, and it is a skill.
Yeah.
And I need you to help me get better at it and to help put people in my life that will like treat reading like weightlifting, like any other physical, because it is a physical endeavor.
Sure.
To sit and to read is a physical and mental endeavor, and to take it as seriously as your golf swing.
That's going to be a hard prayer to pray for a lot of us, I would say.
But if God answers that prayer, and you are so diligent to try to become a better reader, God helped me become a better reader. God changed my heart, and after a while, I was like, I just love to read. Like it created a love for reading in me, and that's of God. That's something God did in me. That's nothing I did, and I coupled that with my effort to physically get better as a reader.
Sure.
And when those two things collide, you'll find that a whole new world of information opens up to you.
Sure.
And a whole new world of dialogue opens up. And I want that for you.
Like we're sitting in a pub. Right. Reading. I love it. The backdrop's perfect. You can see it from this angle. First, before we end, this is awesome, right? I mean,
a lot of leather-bound books.
Oh my gosh,
smells like rich mahogany in here.
Look, you can't see this other side. There's this wooden door over here that I'm in love with.
That is, by the way, straight out of a Narnia book.
Oh,
the little door.
We'll show it somehow, some way on social or something. This is awesome. We're excited about it, and we're excited to just continue to journey. Yeah. To dive into books, and thank you for listening, because this is we've been looking forward to this for a while. This is something that we wanted to do. So appreciate it. C.S. Lewis, you got anything else for real?
That's it, man. I'll let you toss this out, man.
We will toss it out. Screwtape Letters, episode 1 of Book Club, whatever you want to call it. Thanks so much for listening. Corbin Collective on Instagram, @Corbin Collective. Follow us. We'll be doing a lot more. Appreciate it. Thanks so much. Talk to you next time.